Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today. Firstly, I would like to introduce myself. I am Kirsty McCurdy, the Marketing Manager for the AICPA and SEMA conferences in association with Connect 365. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Colin Iles, who is one of the speakers at the AICPA and SEMA Finance Transformation Conference in Johannesburg. Today, he will be presenting his webinar on how to become an innovation catalyst. I will now pass the presentation over to Colin to continue. I hope you all enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Kirsty, and a very warm welcome to everyone joining this webinar. As Kirsty said, my name's Colin Iles, and just a quick intro, I'm the CEO of the EQUINOX, which is an Innovation and Leadership Centre in Sandton in Joburg. If you're in that neck of the woods, give us a shout. We'd love to host you and have some interesting discussions about how business models need to change for the 21st century. And if you can't, and you're just joining the webinar, let's just quickly get into what we're going to go and run through. And the topic is become an innovation catalyst. And really what we're going to go and highlight is why you need to become an innovation catalyst. It's structured a little bit towards the finance function, but if you're not from the finance function or that's not part of your history, too much, because a lot of the themes that we're going to be running through, I think, are universal and applicable for all roles and functions in organizations today. And we're going to go and start running through what it is that these forces that are changing the way that businesses have to operate, and why not changing could be quite damaging for the organizations that you actually support. I'm also very privileged to be one of the ambassadors for EXOLEVER. I don't know if we're going to have time to talk about what EXOLEVER is, but two great books that I do really recommend everyone does get hold of if they can and read through. Exponential Organization, 3 or 4 years old, Exponential Transformation, both the brainchild of Salim Ismail, and two books that I thoroughly recommend for anyone that's interested in challenging the business models that they're operating today and the ones that we are, and I'm certainly suggesting that you need to think about for an exponential world. And just very quickly, some credentials on my side. My background is financial services. I've been working in corporate investment banking for nigh on 20 years now. And over the last couple of years, I've been specifically focused on consulting two large organizations to go and help them to understand how they can increase their innovation speeds and across their organization. And that's just a quick sample of some of the clients that I've dealt with over the last 12 months or so. So let's start in the future and ask the question, so how did you go bankrupt then? And I think Ernest Hemingway summed this up beautifully in The Sun Also Rises when he says, 2 ways, gradually and then suddenly. Let's show you what I mean by that.
So when we talk about the decay in organizations that we can expect, this isn't something that is going to be happening in 5 or 10 years. It's already happening now. In this chart from CV Insights, and if you don't subscribe to CV Insights, I really recommend it. They're full of fantastic analytics on what's happening to the corporate world. But as they're showing here, 52% of S&P 500 companies have already disappeared in the last 15 years. And when you listen to experts in the field, the consensus seems to be that this rate of decay is just simply going to increase. And it's going to increase because of what's happening in the startup community. And the threat from startups really cannot be underestimated. Here's another great chart from CV Insights, which shows that there are now hundreds of startups that have had VC funding and can quite easily now and sensibly be valued at $1 billion or more based on those funding rounds. And what you can also see is that over the last 10 or so years, the number of startups that are reaching these unicorn valuation status is just increasing exponentially. The last chart that I looked at showed that there's about 300 unicorns now globally that didn't exist as little as 5 or 6 years ago.
So as we continue this thought process of imagining ourselves in 3, 4, 5 years' time, it would feel to me that we've missed something today. What threats and opportunities did we miss?
The first one is that there's this massive abundance of new technologies that are out there. This is a lovely chart from Imperial College in London, pretending to be a sort of periodic table of technologies. And it's highlighting that it's not just 5, 10, maybe 15 or 20 broad technologies such as AI or robotics or up-and-coming development in quantum computing. It's also thinking about how, when you break down those technologies, those are broad classifiers, there are many, many use cases and variations of those technologies. So when you're talking robotics, it could be of the big sort, which you might be imagining will be doing mining type work, or it could be going down to nanobots, where they're starting to develop platforms and technology, which eventually they hope you'll be able to actually ingest and inject into your bloodstream, for example, to go and find cancer. Or if you look at AI, it could be visual AI for recognition of objects, which is being used in driverless cars, or it could be AI being used in call centers, so you can have conversations with machines which are contextually understood, with answers being given back to you. It doesn't matter where you look, there is just an abundance of technology. And the other fascinating thing is that they augment off each other, because a lot of it requires computer processing power. Moore's law is starting to get even faster as we see chip technology advance even more, quantum computing coming in, the energy requirements that you need, the cost of energy is starting to go down, especially with photovoltaic and solar really spurring things on. And as you can do that, your processing time allows you to go and use AI more effectively, and Internet of Things and big data lakes, giving you more information for the AI to be more effective. And so you see this compounding effect where the technologies are helping each other out so that they're becoming more and more useful every single day. And this virtuous circle that gets created from this abundance of technology is then really bringing down the barriers to entry. So whereas before, for a large corporate, you used to be able to survive basically by protecting the IP and hiring all of the boffins and researchers into your own organization, and that would definitely give you a competitive advantage. Those barriers are now being stripped away. Here's a little example from Audacity where it's giving you a course to learn how to build a self-driving car. And there is actually examples of people who've done this course, and they've done exactly that over a period of weeks. A very basic version, of course. It won't be competing with Volvo and Uber anytime soon. But nonetheless, you're starting to see people across the globe being able to access these different technologies. And really, it's coming down to the simple requirement of, do you have a computer and have you got reasonable internet access? And if you've got those two things, pretty much everyone is able to start competing across almost every single industry that's out there. So the third thing that I think we're going to look back in years to come with regret about is our own corporate immune system. If the first two were external factors, where an abundance of technologies and a reduction in the barriers to entry so that anyone across the globe can start creating new markets or challenging incumbents, the incumbents have only got themselves to blame in not being able to compete effectively because of their own immune system. As they focus on their brand and maintaining the status quo and using business models that were effective over the last 30 or 40 years, it also has the unintended consequence of really preventing innovation from happening within those organizations at the same scale and speed as that of a startup. And so it's not really about individual people who are just simply naysayers or are in decision-making roles and are particularly difficult to get past. It's more the structure that's set up within organizations today that is creating the environment for naysayers to breed. And I've certainly been many times in my career where I found myself in that position because of the control frameworks that I've been requested to adhere by.
So let's talk about finance in organizations today. In many ways, they are the creator, the supporter for generating a nice, robust organization. But you can probably guess where I'm going to go here, because robust organizations in a world where things are moving exponentially isn't necessarily a good thing. In fact, it could potentially be a disastrous.
So let's start by thinking of some of the key characteristics that one would expect within a finance function. And this word cloud, I think, sums it up quite nicely. Certainly in my time within finance, I was expected to be analytical, to be the person that could go and translate numbers into stories which I could present back to the senior leadership team so they can take better decisions. I was certainly in the role of being a steward, looking for ways to improve margin, being very analytical, looking for comparatives, looking for ways to go and predict, and really putting control frameworks in place across the rest of the organization that allowed for transparent, timely, and accurate reporting of financial data, which could then be used for reporting or decision-making purposes. And those are all great characteristics for a finance team. In fact, they're great characteristics for many teams, especially if you believe that the world is relatively linear and in some way it's normally distributed. And what I mean by that is that by taking the view that over the next couple of years things are going to change, but perhaps they're not going to change radically, that focus on profits, cost conscientiousness, making sure valuations are applied through in terms of US GAAP or whichever GAAP you're working with, managing working capital effectively so that you are able to minimize expensive funding requirements, doing detailed competitor analysis, or running through investments and forecasting and projections. They're all really, really valid things to be doing. But, and this is an important but, the world isn't now normally distributed. It's no longer linear. It really has gone exponential. And let me explain. So here's a very simple chart just comparing linear and exponential. But I like it because if you believe that this abundance of technologies and the reduction of barriers to entry is changing the business landscape and allowing startups to come and compete and create new markets at speeds that we've never seen before, and are nowhere near as fast as we're going to see them throughout over the next 5 or 10 years. Although, as it stands today on our timeline, we are thinking that everything is okay. Over the next couple of years, it's suddenly going to be sitting back and going, where did that startup come from? How did we suddenly find 20 or 30 people competing with our customers, offering products and services to solve issues in totally and radically different ways to the way that we've been doing them to date? And so the business model to apply in your organization, the way that finance should operate, really does depend, I think, a lot on whether you believe the world is exponential or whether you believe that progress will continue to be relatively linear. So let's challenge that bell curve and for a minute imagine we do live in an exponential world. The green area is now a lot broader, and what it's trying to represent is that by focusing on the core, by maintaining a robust organization, you might find that a lot of the efforts are actually being wasted because whatever you're doing is going to be irrelevant in 2 or 3 years' time. And also in doing that, it ties up resources who could be looking at those outliers, those fanciful things which are difficult to predict, difficult to imagine, but in 2 or 3 years' time are going to be incredibly common. So let's just use one example from the list there. Is there any point doing competitor analysis anymore when I'm suggesting that your biggest threat isn't really coming from the incumbent competitors, it's probably coming from a startup in Shanghai, Beijing, Frankfurt, Israel somewhere who you've never heard of, but they've grasped a technology and found a new way to go and solve a problem. Another challenge I'd like to make is if we believe the world is going exponential, do we actually look at the right sorts of numbers and interpret them in the correct way? If I didn't give context, which I will do in a minute, to this particular chart, you'd look at it and say, oh, net income 0 for the last 20 years, no growth. This, if I'm the CFO of that company, would suggest I should probably be fired. But this isn't any company. This is a company which, I'll just call up the pieces there, is called Amazon, and they're the second largest company in the world as it stands today, and you can see their share price. But what's fascinating about Amazon and Tesla as an example is that they haven't been driving for profit, and yet they've become incredibly valuable. What they've been doing is they've been saying, we have a vision, we've got a purpose that we're going to go and strive to achieve, and we invite investors to invest behind our mission or our purpose. So we're not really going to be in the game of generating profit and paying dividends. We're going to be looking for ways to take every piece of cash, free cash flow, or anything we can get hold of to reinvest into ideation and experimentation and innovation in order to fulfill our purpose. Join us if you want as an investor, but that's what you're getting. We're not paying out dividend in the standard construct, and therefore we're not going to be showing ourselves as a profitable organization. We're creating immense amount of value. And so as we see this continued development of new opportunities and rapid progress, it starts, I think, to challenge some of the existing business models. If Peter Drucker's correct, you can't manage what you can't measure, then I think we have a real problem, because we're moving into a world where it's becoming incredibly difficult to measure and predict because things are moving so quickly. And certainly the startups that have been incredibly successful haven't really focused on measuring what the output of their people are. They've been a lot more collaborative, and collectively try to fulfill some sort of purpose which they've then achieved. It's really for them wasn't about measuring individual productivity or KRIs and KPIs. So the message really is that too much focus on the numbers, I think, can actually stifle an organization's ability to innovate. Because what you can start to see is that the numbers become the story, and therefore the board and the C-suite and the leadership teams across the various functions really start to drive decision-making around financial KPIs and KRIs, the budget cycle, the quarterly reporting, the shareholder investment sessions. Really, it's all about the numbers. And when you start to see that, and then that becomes the framework that the rest of the organization is working towards, it's not a surprise that you end up with a very short-termist outlook and people start to try to be incredibly safe. And so there are a number of negative consequences which stifle innovation. Some of them I've just listed here below, but we get linear sequential thinking. It starts to become easier to go and operate in designing products and services for the short term because we've got these goals and targets. If I get the goals and targets, I'm successful, I might get promoted, but I'm not going to take those far out of the money, relatively cheap bets because they're 2-3 year programs, and we might not therefore get the returns, and therefore my bonus, my salary, my promotions are going to be in jeopardy. It starts to become easy to start to regress, to innovate from within, and not be willing to go and look for crowdsourcing and to go on platforms like GitHub or Topcoder, or to use some of the ideation platforms where you can get hundreds, thousands, even tens of thousands of people participating in trying to better your products and your services. Perhaps that's because you end up with quite difficult supplier constraints. It's very difficult to onboard new innovative staff or new innovative consultants or new innovative suppliers with different products and services because you've taken big decisions for firm-wide platforms which give you huge scale and efficiency options, but they are also constraining your ability to experiment with other platforms and systems. Of course, strategic planning, it's incredibly easy for us to fall into this. We've experienced it this way for the last 10 years, and therefore it's quite easy to extrapolate from that over the next 1 or 2 years. And in a world that's not linear, which is going to this exponential state, I think that's incredibly dangerous. As I showed earlier, we start to go and make very poor projections about where we should be focusing our money and resources. And the big thing, perhaps the biggest thing, is this huge risk intolerance that starts to just become part of the company DNA, because we need to make sure we're hitting these targets and these numbers, and therefore I'm going to take the safest possible routes to go and do that. I'm not going to be willing to divert 10-20% of my capital and resources for these far out of the money bets. Process inflexibility I've sort of touched on. That just becomes a thing because we have to be structured to make sure that we're going to have the results that are coming through in a transparent and timely and accurate sort of way, and therefore anything that rocks that system that's being created is not tolerated. The antibodies will come out in full force. And of course, it can also lead to large numbers of FTA as we manage these numbers and we try to go and get control, and we have management accountants and project managements with financial focus springing up all over the place, and lots of layers that are added to go and make sure the control framework works. And it can also then start leading us to making interesting decisions about what we want to do with our assets. We feel safer perhaps buying our assets in because we can then go and maneuver this from a margin perspective of how we depreciate and allocate and match against other components of our businesses. And the net result is that we can find ourselves very much investing in the status quo. So those are the negative, or just an example of some of the negative potential implications of an incredibly strong financial culture. But it is possible to change it, and really the next section is the more exciting bit, because that's where we go into how to change that. So let's now move on to something more positive and run through a couple of ideas what finance could do to try and help their organizations become more adaptable and more innovative. And maybe the first one is to start with a two-tier finance model. And by that I mean nothing more than breaking up the approach that finance takes to manage the business. There's the 80% that sits there in core, where pretty much nothing changes because it's still incredibly important to have a protection mechanism and analytics mechanism to protect the business and to give valid data about today, yesterday, and certainly in the near term. But then maybe there's 20% that needs to go off towards thinking about how to incentivize people to think exponentially. And really, to help people think exponentially, it's nothing more than trying to bring startup mentalities into the business. So you're looking for wastage and duplication, and you want experimentation, all these things the antibodies hated. And you want failures, and you want to learn from those failings, and therefore you're going to go through these test, learn, iterate cycles. And because of the approach that you're taking, you don't know what the final outcome is going to be, and that's cool, because you're chasing something purposeful. You've got a vision, a moonshot. Maybe it's a massive transformative purpose, and you certainly can't quantify whether it will be profitable or not. And obviously this is all built around customers, or maybe even it's going bigger than that, and society as a whole. Certainly if you're chasing, let's uplift the living standards of 1 billion people. But to do that, finance have got to start thinking in very different ways about how to manage the types of people and processes that are needed to create that type of environment. So if the finance function shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all, and there's 80% that's allocated to the core, and in terms of making sure 80% of capital is going into the core, perhaps 20% of resources and capital should be allocated into the exponential. But if you want to do that, you're going to be facing some interesting budget requests for projects, because people will come to you and say, I've only got an idea, I really don't have too much else. There is perhaps not even a business case. It's impossible to size the opportunity. It's just too far-sized. It's never been done before. Perhaps the technology is not even available yet. If we didn't have people doing that, you wouldn't have the Google car now, started by the ex-company in AstroTeller. The team's got no experience. Well, that's another great parody to AstroTeller. I don't think he came from a car manufacturing business. And others have tried and failed before. This is typically where you say no, and yet in a world which is going exponential, it's where the finance function, I think, needs to encourage people to say, yes, let's give it a go. But we have to set different metrics and different measures to go and determine whether we're being successful. Now, here's 3 examples, 2 where the bets were wrong and 1 where the bet was definitely right. The first one is USV, a VC in the US. They had the opportunity to put $150,000 in to go and fund Airbnb, and they chose not to. Another great example, I think it's an even better example, is Blockbusters, who in the year they made $5 billion, decided not to invest $5 million into this postal startup called Netflix. And again, the antibodies were there because they were really focusing on their $5 billion. They didn't imagine the future, and if they did, they thought they could deal with it at a later point in time. It was much more effective for them at that time, in their minds at least, to go and worry about the 17% of their revenue stream that came from late charges. They missed the opportunity on what should have been a simple, far out of the money option, which they were taking, put that money into Netflix. On the other hand, here's a really positive success story, which is Google. They put $50 million by all accounts into Android at a time when it was really an operating system for cameras, and they had no idea what the potential or even what they would do with it would be, and it's now 80–90% of phones that are powered by that operating system. It's incredibly important, therefore, I think, for finance teams to worry less about the future and to think more about the cost of what it is to do today, and I'll go into that in just a second. So when the future is unclear, the one thing that is clear is today and the next couple of months. And so I think a model which really more organizations need to get behind is really an option portfolio model, where it's not easy to predict what's happening in the future, so stop trying to do it. Start looking for things where the probability of success might be incredibly low, but we can see and we can feel that the benefits might be incredibly large. But what we do know is that today the cost of doing it is relatively small, and therefore we're looking for lots of small bets where we can put small amounts of money in, because if just 1 or 2 of them pay off, they're going to pay off incredibly well. And this is a sports bet, obviously, with Leicester City as a one-off bet. We should have all put money onto that. The Premier League with just 20 clubs, 1 in 5,000 probability, and then thinking on a portfolio basis of other sports where we could do similar bets. Why aren't we all doing that? So I guess what I'm trying to highlight is that we probably spend far too much time trying to predict the future. I don't think there's anyone out there who is gifted with crystal ball gazing to do that effectively. The reason that startups are a threat isn't because of any particular one, it's because there are so many of them. And the VCs that do well don't do well because they just happen to have picked, 50% as opposed to 30% of successful businesses. They're winning because the 1 or 2 bets that they're getting that do well are 10x growth businesses, as opposed to the other VCs that are sitting there with maybe 3x or 4x growth businesses. So as an example of a corporate that does this particularly well, let's take Amazon, well, let's take Google, or let's maybe take Facebook as it stands at the moment. Let's see where they end up over the next couple of years. The reason that these companies are winning is because it's not reported that they're losing 99 times out of 100. They are allowing their workforce across the board to make experiments every single day, of which the vast majority of them fail and they don't get publicity. And so then along they come with Amazon Go, and it's a big success, and it suddenly appears as if they've just had this magic formula. They don't. The formula that they've applied is that working with finance, they're allowing people to go and run experiments using a model which is allowing them to test, to fail, to learn, to iterate. And what they are managing is that those experiments are made to fail fast if they're clearly not working, and that the experiments are going to be something which you can always learn from. And you learn quickly. And as you learn quickly, you decide to stop or to pivot or to go and actually put more money into it because it's starting to look like it has got data suggesting it is going to be a viable thing to go and do. So can finance change and become a catalyst for innovation? And the answer is absolutely, and here's how. Firstly, and I think perhaps most obviously, you have to believe the world is now moving exponentially. If you think it's still linear and you can compete using the business models of yesteryear, then don't change. You have to believe that the landscape you operate in has actually changed fundamentally. Sounds simple, but I think in fact it's incredibly hard, and it's the biggest step that we actually have to take. Black box thinking, I think human nature really is predisposed to making us think about the future based on our past, and therefore it's no real surprise when you look at the IEA, the International Energy Authority, making these predictions about how they see the progression of installed capacity of photovoltaic. It's straight line and linear, and it doesn't matter which year that you look at for their forecasts. The reality is the cost of installation and the amount of installation has been exponential for many years now, and even though it has been doubling up in terms of the amount of installed capacity and the price has been doubling down, we still see these straight line forecasts coming through. It's human nature to underestimate the rate of progress. I think Bill Gates really nails it here when he goes and shows that it's not just our ability to underestimate the future, we also overestimate the next year or two, or maybe the next 12 months. Which those two things counteract each other because, oh, it's going to be amazing in the next 2 years, AI is going to change everything, it doesn't change anything, we go back to the status quo, and then we totally underestimate how AI is going to change things in the next 5 years. So if you can get yourself into a mindset where you believe that the world is now changing exponentially, I think the second step there is to actually be humble enough to realize that what we've done over the last 10 or 20 years is going to have to change. We have to be humble and inwardly looking to say, it was great what we've done before, but now we're going to have to go and try some different techniques and models if we want to be successful in the future. It's not just the organizations that are going to have to be adaptable, it's ourselves as individuals. I think Bezos is a great example here. I mean, he takes it so literally, he's actually named his office Day One, because he's so scared that he himself and his organization in general are going to end up in this Day Two stasis of mediocrity and linear thinking, where he really does see that that would just lead to the demise of Amazon, where it's irrelevant, it's an excruciating and painful decline followed by death. He's actually making himself incredibly afraid of the future to bring himself the ability to be adaptable and change the approaches and techniques that he and his workforce are having to take every single day. My third recommendation for organizations that want to change, and it's not just the finance function, is if you believe the world is going exponential, if you've brought yourself to a mental state to challenge yourself that the way you have acted before is not how you're going to be acting in the future if you want to survive and thrive. Then the third thing is to go and find a purpose beyond profit. Now, what do I mean by a purpose beyond profit? Well, simply it's a vision or a mission which goes far above and beyond the demands of making sure that shareholders go and get dividends. It's almost an evangelical calling to do something for the benefit of, at the very least, your customers and clients, and potentially for society as a whole. And we'll give you a couple of examples. I think Tesla, making sustainable transport commonplace. is a nice one. The thing that you get with it is fascinating because it allows you to create a movement. You get people binding around and supporting you. It's your North Star. And so when Amazon doesn't pay out dividend, as an example, that's okay because they've got this vision to be the most customer-centric platform in the world, and people invest into that and give them huge amounts of leeway to try and achieve that objective or goal. It's a very different emotional state that you can create for your stakeholders when you're in that type of play, as opposed to we're going to go and search for very numerical and measurable measures such as here's a profit and a dividend and a 10% growth year on year and a certain improvement on margin that we've promised to our stakeholders. The facts behind it are that companies that find purpose tend to outperform the rest of their competitors. Here's a little article from the Financial Times a few years back. Companies with a purpose beyond profit tend to make more money. And here's another piece of research, this time from Ernst & Young, where they're highlighting that purposeful companies have outperformed the S&P 500 by 10 times between 1996 and 2011.
If you're in South Africa, you'll know Discovery. In fact, actually, Discovery are quite international now. You might have heard of them no matter where you're located. Here we have a very purposeful CEO. I started Discovery with the core purpose of making people healthier and enhancing and protecting people's lives. That's the chart when you go and look at their competitors here in SA.
Here's another example. This time it's Paul Polman and Unilever, making sustainable living commonplace, a very altruistic goal. They also want to uplift the living standards of 1 billion people. As a matter of fact, when you look at their chart, a very similar comparison to their competitors. And what's fascinating is when Pullman took over in 2009, there was a big dip, 20-25% in their share price. And look what's happened since that point in time.
Here we have BlackRock, another good example. Not the company you'd expect to be supporting purposeful organizations, making that transition to want to support corporations that serve a social purpose. They are not doing that because they are going 100% altruistic. They're also seeing companies that do want to serve a social purpose becoming incredibly profitable.
And of course, back to Amazon again, our vision is to be the Earth's most customer-centric company. And if it wasn't for that vision, they wouldn't be putting patents and research effort and costs into designing warehousing which looks like a beehive and where drones are delivering and exporting the product from the warehouse. And the reason they're doing that is because they're trying to work out how to deliver Ben & Jerry's ice cream in 20 minutes or less from inner city New York, and real estate's too expensive, so let's invent a warehouse that's basically a skyscraper. I don't think profit-driven, financially driven companies would be able to go and take those types of experimentation decisions. It's really companies that are scared about the future, they can see it's exponential, they're very, very worried about becoming day two, and they have some sort of purpose, potentially altruistic, which is driving them forward continually. And so let's close out there, and let's close out with Microsoft and a quick summary. Microsoft are a fascinating example about a purposeful organization. For much of this century, actually, they've been really very unpurposeful. They've had a profit target of putting PCs and software into every corporate and every home. And in 2014, when Satya Nadella comes along, he says, no, our mission, our purpose is to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. And since 2014, their share prices has rocketed. More importantly, whenever I engage with the staff at Microsoft, they're loving the journey that they're on. And they are super proud of the new initiatives that they're actually, rolling through. And if they continue on that journey, I think Microsoft are just going to go from strength to strength. So let's summarize the message. From a starting point, the first key thing to consider is, as much as finance brings immense value to organizations, there are perhaps unintended consequences that can bring, especially when it comes to reducing the level and speed and energy that gets put into the innovation projects. And a lot of that is because frameworks and numbers are really curtailing people's ability to take what is perceived as risky initiatives, and therefore it just doesn't happen. But, and this is the beautiful thing, I think it is quite easy to go and change that, especially if finance start to sit there and think, let's run a two-tier model. There are financial models and processes that definitely do work for the core, and for the stable business lines, but we need to go and find different models with different metrics and different measures for maybe 10-20% of the organization to inspire people to actually go and innovate. And the transition to go and do that, I don't think is that complex. It requires more of an emotional change than necessarily anything in terms of numbers and platforms. And the first thing, we'll just quickly go through them as a quick summary, is one, are you in the movie that we are now moving from a linear to an exponential world? You have to believe that the exponentialism is coming, otherwise there's no point in changing any of the models. They've worked perfectly well for the last 50 or 60 years. Number two is, are you afraid of that change? Because if you're not afraid of it, how are you going to go and reassess the skills that you've learned over the 10, 20 years prior to go and start experimenting and believing that you can do new things in different ways, and it's worth taking the risk to try to make that change and be adaptable. And then if you can do that, you need something a little bit more positive to get behind. And then the first thing that I put at the top of the list as a cornerstone for every successful organization nowadays is purpose. It doesn't matter who you look at, the fastest growing companies on the planet today typically have a purpose which is certainly based around improving the client's journey, and that's at the heart, the center of every decision that they take. And quite often it's even more altruistic than that, and it's saying we're going to go do something on a global basis which uplifts living standards of 1 billion people or improves the lives of billions of people. And if you can get those becoming the center point of how you take your decisions on a daily basis, I think that opens up a really, really good gateway to slowly start to transition the organization to inspire people to bind behind this purpose so that they, in turn, can be granted the autonomy to take risk, make mistakes, start thinking of the decisions that they're making from a customer-centric perspective, and really to bring on an experimentation type culture where the goal isn't to predict, the goal is to learn, the goal is to make mistakes, the goal is to do that on an industrial scale, to fail fast, and to bring that startup community culture back into the organization. And if you can do that as a finance team, then I think that you have enabled a fantastic change in your organizations, because apart from, let's say, HR, I think finance is one of the most important functions within an organization that can both kill and squash innovation, but alternatively in a more positive way can be the catalyst for innovation to help your companies survive and thrive in an exponential world. And so with that, I'll hand back over to Kirsty, and then I guess we go on to Q&A. I hope that was useful, and I'm thinking she'll be putting up some connection details if you want to connect with me and ask more questions and discuss any of these points further. And I hope you really enjoyed and got something out of this presentation.
Thank you very much for that interesting webinar, Colin. Please do email me if you have any questions about the webinar. Alternatively, you may submit questions through the Q&A box on your screen within the next 5 minutes. If you can't make the Finance Transformation Johannesburg conference, it will also be happening in New York and London this year. The recorded slides will be sent to you very soon so you can watch on demand. Thank you for joining this webinar and have a great day.